Hey, it's Randy Blythe, and you are watching Heavy Consequence. Hemingway is pretty famous for really reshaping modern English prose. He was a master of economy of vocabulary, saying more with less. Um, and this book, he's probably most famous for his novels like The Sun Also Rises, etc. But this book it's not exactly a memoir. I think they call it a nonfiction novel sometimes, but it's really what it is. It's a memoir of his time in the 1920s in Paris with his first wife as a young artist. And that's a period that I'm absolutely obsessed with. All the expatriates were over there in the 1920s. Gertrude Stein, him, uh, all sorts of artists. Fitzgerald were over there, and they were creating and writing, and there was this vibrant artistic community on the left bank of Paris. And I've always just had this romantic obsession with it, to the point where the first time I went to Paris, I went over to the left bank and went to all the cafes he wrote about in the book, went to where his old apartment was, just seeing the sights. And it's just a wonderful portrait of a master of the written word as a young man, really settling into his craft. And I bought a first edition of it in Paris at Shakespeare and Company, which is one of my favorite bookstores. Please Kill Me is a wonderful book. It is an oral history of the very beginnings of punk rock. In fact, it starts before punk rock, with Velvet Underground, Patti Smith, Iggy and the Stooges, the MC5, the sort of proto-punk stuff. And then it moves into where punk was first really born, which is, of course, in New York City in the 70s with the CBGBs, like the mid to sort of late mid 70s. And it ends, I believe, in 77, right around the time, 78, around Sid Vicious dies, because he had come to New York. Punk rock had gone to England and taken a different shape, a bit more nihilistic. But it is just a wonderful portrait of the birth of this underground genre, this genre of music from which my genre of music springs, because modern aggressive metal is a descendant of thrash metal, which is, of course, a marriage of heavy metal and punk rock. So it's a really, really neat read, and it talks to a lot of neat characters and just shows how new and fresh everything was, and also set in the rather decaying environs of New York City in the 70s. So it was a different time. I just love the book, and I've gotten lucky enough. I've been lucky enough to play CBGB before it closed down, and I walked on the stage, and I felt the weight of that history when I walked on stage. The Ramones, Blondie, Television, Suicide, all these bands played there, the Dead Boys. It was just really cool, having read that book, to kind of walk into that history. Pat Conroy is an author who was raised for most of his life in a town called Beaufort, South Carolina. It's in the Low Country outside Charleston, and all of his novels are drawn from his family. He had a really screwed up family. I don't know if you ever saw the movie or read the book, The Great Santini, that's based on his father. He referred to himself as the Great Santini. But he writes just so beautifully. I believe in the primacy of story, and Pat Conroy was a masterful storyteller. He wove these long, incredibly complex and intricate novels, these different threads together into these just beautiful stories. They didn't feel clunky or overburdened. They just sucked you in, and it was every book of his I've ever read, I just haven't wanted it to end. So he is one of my absolute favorite authors of all time, and I was lucky enough to send him a copy of my first book, and he read it before he died, and he quite enjoyed it. He sent me a copy of one of his other books, The Prince of Tides, made out to me, and made out The Singer of Lamb of God. It was so cool, you know. But Beach Music is my favorite of Pat Conroy's books. He is just a wonderful, wonderful storyteller, and, you know, rest in peace to him. Stephen Pressfield is I believe he's in his 80s now, and he is a guy who started trying to be a writer in his 20s, and it wasn't until in his 40s, I believe, that he had any sort of success. He wrote a novel called The Legend of Bagger Vance, which was later made into a movie. And then he went into historical fiction. He's really known for that. He wrote The Gates of Fire, which is about the same event that the movie 300 was based on, the Spartans, and got a very large audience with that. But he also writes about writing, about the creative life. And there are a million books on writing, but very few of them are worth a crap. This book was given to me when I started writing my first book by another writer, and he said, The War of Art, here it is. This for writers is like a hatchet if the house is burning down, if you're blocked. You reach for this. And it's a short book. It's not complex. It's not simple. I mean, it's very simple. In a way, I think it almost hypnotizes you into believing, yes, I can do this. I can get through this. Because it deals with what he calls resistance in the capital R, which is self-doubt and the inner editor, and how to push through that. So it is a wonderful, wonderful book that countless other writers, artists, musicians have recommended it, and I felt I would be remiss if I didn't. Follow Bajagalupi. This is a science fiction book, an incredibly detailed science fiction book that takes place in Thailand in the future. And water, the sea levels have risen, so different as is actually happening, the sea levels are rising and land masses are getting swallowed. So the city of Bangkok in this, it's in the future, is completely encircled by water, and large agricultural companies at this point have patented seeds, which also has happened. This happens just like in real life with Monsanto and all those people. They have patented seeds, so they have a stranglehold on sort of the world's food supply. And the kingdom of Thailand is sort of alone in it's an island in the water. And they have a very fertile environment for growing food and stuff, and it takes place in this. It takes place in Bangkok in the future. There's water everywhere, and food is scarce, and there's a lot of international pressure to kind of take Thailand's seed banks, their seed banks. So, and also in the future, this is also at the end result naturally of the fossil fuels. The fossil fuels have about run out, so they have to find alternative power sources. So it's a really interesting future commentary on the damage that we are causing our environment with our actions, and what the future could possibly look like. I love The Lord of the Rings, I'm a big nerd. And from when I was a small child, I had, I don't know if you remember, they had those little Fisher-Price record players, and you got a record with a little book, and when the sound goes ding, turn the page. I had the version of that of The Hobbit. And I loved that, but then eventually my dad had the regular version of The Hobbit. So I read that as a young child, and that primed me for The Lord of the Rings. And The Lord of the Rings is the standard for all the other fantasy epics that have followed. Game of Thrones is massive. Those books were massive. Harry Potter, massive. all of those books descend from Lord of the Rings. Any sort of epic fantasy tale comes from the Lord of the Rings. And the world that Tolkien created is incredibly detailed and complex. And he was just a wonderful, wonderful writer. So I am a nerd. I do like fantasy and elves and dragons and crap. But the OG is Lord of the Rings, and I will reread it every few years to this day. It's never let me down. Marcus Aurelius was an emperor of Rome. He was known as the last good emperor of Rome. And he was an interesting character. He was a student of Stoic philosophy, and he was trained from a young age in Stoic philosophy, and he did not want to be the emperor at all. He would have much rather have been a philosopher, but it fell on his shoulders. He was being groomed for it because the emperor before him saw his potential, and he was an incredibly just man. And so towards the end of his life, he was writing in his journal. He was writing his thoughts to himself about life, how he viewed life, how to deal with problematic situations, how to deal with problematic people. And this writing was not directed to anyone at all. It was just his private journal. But when he died of the plague, during the Antonine Plague. When he died, his successors found this, and it was passed around. Just a journal to a guy talking to himself about life and how to most effectively live it. And it is a wonderful, wonderful document. It is one of the cornerstones of Stoic philosophy. It was written about 2,000 years ago, but I can read it today, and the things he's talking about, the problems he's facing, the difficulties he's facing, are exactly the same as today. 2,000 years later, it's just got a facelift. It's just different window dressing. And he was a pretty smart guy who was a disciplined man, and figured out a way to kind of deal with the troubles of his soul, including his mortality, very articulately. So I read a bit of it every single morning. It's a wonderful book. Brad Warner is he's become a friend of mine. He is a OG hardcore punk rocker from Akron, Ohio. He was in a pretty legendary hardcore band back in the very early 80s called Zero Defects. And then he went to Japan. He was interested in learning meditation when he was in college. And he was also interested in like Godzilla movies and Ultraman and stuff like that. So he went to Japan and went to work for the company that made, I think, the Ultraman movies. And while he was there, he started studying Zen with this ordained Zen master named Nishijima. And eventually he ordained him as a quote-unquote Zen master, which Brad will tell you it's just kind of window dressing. It doesn't mean much in real life. But he writes very, very interestingly about the practice of meditation and the philosophy behind Zen, and viewing the true basis of reality itself, which he kind of also views it through the punk rock filter, because that's the world he comes from. So he writes very, very interestingly and accessibly through a sort of punk rock lens about very complex matters, matters of time and space and reality itself, and how to sort of see them clearly, I guess, or at least attempt to through meditation. So I myself meditate at times infrequently. My practice is crap. I need to work on it. But reading his book always inspires me. It's a great book. Cody Lundin, he also is a friend of mine. Cody Lundin was one of the original hosts of a TV show that was on Discovery Channel called Dual Survivor. They had a military dual survival. They had a military type guy who always wanted to kill everybody. And then they had this crazy tank like barefoot guy who's just like, no, let's like try and think our way through this. That's my buddy, Cody, the barefoot guy. And I met him before he had the TV show. We became friends, and he is a real deal primitive living skills instructor. And he lives self-sufficiently off the grid, way out in the desert in Arizona. I've been to his house. It's fucking crazy. It's like an Earth ship. It is always, I believe it's always at like 72.3 degrees, no matter how hot or how cold it is outside, and without any sort of external heat or cooling. He's using the properties of the Earth, thermodynamics. But he's a real deal primitive living skills and survival instructor. I've been out in the desert with him, for 9 days at a time with nothing, and it's an amazing experience. I think these days most people have lost touch with some fairly basic concepts of how to live if things go bad, because we're all behind these screens and we're in the city so much, and I'm not a crazy prepper, but I think that stuff that, like, my grandma, for instance, just took for granted. Of course they grew their own food. Of course she canned her own food. Of course they knew how to smoke meat. All these things, basic things. Of course they knew where to get clean water. All these things that were taken for granted by older generations because they were just a part of their life have disappeared. So I think it's valuable for people, especially if you look today, we're in, natural disasters. Look at like New Orleans, look at the fires that just happened in California. You never know when your resources are going to be taken away from you. So this book, 98.6 Degrees, is a lot about the basic mentality, sort of survival, which survival is, I think, 90% mental and 10% physical, because people who freak out die in difficult situations. So it's a great book, and it has some practical tips and some knowledge about physiology, but it's a real basic primer. It's also written in very accessible language. I would recommend it for everyone. Also, he wrote another book called When All Hell Breaks Loose that came out next. That has more in-depth actual suggestions for things to get or so forth, but highly recommend it. This is it's an interesting book. It's about a murder that took place. Well, that's the sort of the inciting incident about a murder that took place in a great big house down in Savannah, Georgia. And it's a journalist had gone down there to sort of investigate. John Barrenta had gone down there to investigate this murder, and the story just kept on getting weirder and weirder and weirder. And there are all these strange characters in Savannah, Georgia. And Savannah is an awesome town. It's got this gothic beauty, these old houses, Spanish moss hanging down from the trees everywhere. Just a wonderful story. So it's a really well written story about a murder, and B, about the strangeness of this unique sort of southern town, which I like odd things, so I quite enjoyed it.